Don't touch him, the oldest son snapped, staring down at his father on the marble floor. If this is another one of Dad's games, I'm not playing. The billionaire's hand trembled against his chest. His second son stepped back like the old man was contagious. The youngest checked his watch. And the only person who ran toward him was the maid. Clara May Jenkins dropped the silver tray so hard that crystal glasses shattered across the floor. "Mr. Whitmore!" she cried, falling to her knees beside him. "Stay with me. Look at me. Breathe." Three grown sons stood in a $12 million mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, surrounded by oil paintings, polished floors, and a lifetime of privilege. But not one of them bent down. Not one of them called 911. Not one of them reached for their father's hand. Because they were too busy wondering what his collapse would mean for the will. Nathaniel Whitmore had built one of the largest hotel companies in America. His name was on towers in New York, resorts in Florida, conference centers in Dallas, and luxury properties from Boston to Los Angeles. People called him ruthless. People called him brilliant. But behind the closed doors of Whitmore House, he was just an old widower sitting at the head of a dining table, watching his three sons become strangers. Preston, the oldest, wore tailored suits and smiled like every room owed him respect. Blake, the second, was charming in public and cruel in private. Ethan, the youngest, had never held a real job longer than 6 months, but he spoke about money like he had earned every penny himself. Their mother had died 8 years earlier. After that, Nathaniel tried to keep the family together with Sunday dinners, family trips, and positions inside the company. But the more he gave them, the less grateful they became. They spoke to assistants like servants. They treated drivers like furniture. And they treated Clara May Jenkins like she was invisible. Clara had worked in that house for 22 years. She knew which medicine Nathaniel took with breakfast. She knew he hated cold coffee. She knew he stared at his late wife's piano every Christmas Eve but never touched it. She also knew the sound of his footsteps when his heart was heavy. Clara was 61, with tired hands, kind eyes, and a quiet strength that came from raising 2 children alone after her husband died in a factory accident in Ohio. She lived in a small apartment above a laundromat in Stamford. Every morning, she took the bus before sunrise, wearing the same navy coat with the loose button she kept meaning to fix. To the Whitmore sons, she was just the maid. But to Nathaniel, Clara had become the only person in the house who still treated him like a human being. One cold November morning, Nathaniel sat alone in his study while rain tapped against the windows. Across from him was his old friend and attorney, Richard Hayes. Richard placed a sealed envelope on the desk. "You're sure about this?" he asked. Nathaniel looked toward the hallway, where he could hear Preston yelling into a phone about a private jet delay. "I spent my life building wealth," Nathaniel said quietly. "But I failed to build character." Richard sighed. "You already know what they'll do." "No," Nathaniel replied. "I know what I fear they'll do. There's a difference." That afternoon, Nathaniel invited his sons to dinner. The table was set with roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and the expensive wine Preston liked to pretend he understood. Clara placed the food carefully, then stepped back. Nathaniel looked at his sons. "I've made a decision," he said. Preston leaned forward. Blake smiled. Ethan stopped scrolling on his phone. Nathaniel continued, "For 1 week, I am stepping away from the company. No calls. No meetings. No access to my personal accounts. During that week, each of you will be given a simple responsibility." Preston frowned. "Dad, we're not interns." "No," Nathaniel said. "You're my sons." He handed each of them an envelope. Preston opened his first. Inside was a set of keys and a note. "You'll manage the downtown shelter project in Newark," Nathaniel said. "The company pledged funds to renovate it before winter. I want you there in person." Preston laughed once. "You want me at a homeless shelter?" "I want you to keep our promise." Blake opened his envelope. You'll visit St. Agnes Hospital in Queens, Nathaniel said. We sponsor the Children's Recovery Wing. I want you to meet the families and approve whatever emergency needs they have. Blake's smile faded. I have meetings this week. You can reschedule them. Ethan opened his envelope last. You'll oversee the scholarship interviews at Lincoln High in Philadelphia, Nathaniel said. 5 students. Full tuition awards. Ethan stared at the paper. I don't know anything about scholarships. You know what opportunity costs when someone doesn't have it, Nathaniel said. Ethan smirked. Do I? The room went quiet. Then Preston leaned back and said the words that wounded Nathaniel more than he expected. Dad, just tell us what this is really about. Are you changing the will? Blake's eyes moved to his father. Ethan's phone lowered. Clara, standing near the doorway, froze. Nathaniel took a slow breath. That, he said, depends on what I learn this week. The next morning, Preston arrived at the Newark shelter in a black SUV with tinted windows. The building was old, brick, and leaking heat through cracked windows. Mothers waited inside with children wrapped in donated coats. Veterans sat quietly near the wall. A volunteer named Denise showed him the broken furnace. If we don't get this fixed before Friday, she said, we'll have to turn people away. Preston checked his shoes like the floor might stain them. How much? He asked. $78,000 for the furnace and repairs. Preston almost laughed. For this place? Denise stared at him. For the people in this place. He signed nothing. Instead, he called his assistant from the SUV and said, find a cheaper vendor. And make sure Dad sees I showed up. By Thursday, the shelter still had no heat. That same week, Blake walked through St. Agnes Hospital wearing a designer overcoat and a bored expression. A nurse introduced him to a little girl named Sophie who needed a specialized wheelchair before she could go home. Her mother, exhausted and pale, explained that insurance had denied the request twice. Blake nodded like he cared. Then he stepped into the hallway and whispered to the hospital director, if we approve every sob story, people will line up forever. Send it through normal review. The wheelchair was not approved. That night, Blake posted a photo outside the hospital with the caption, proud to support families in need. And Ethan never made it to Lincoln High. He sent a junior employee instead. When one student, a quiet 17-year-old named Marcus Reed, asked if Mr. Whitmore's son would be coming, the employee looked embarrassed. He had a conflict, she said. Ethan's conflict was a golf weekend in Palm Beach. By Friday, Nathaniel had heard enough. But the test was not over. On Saturday morning, Clara arrived early and found Nathaniel in the kitchen instead of his study. He wore an old brown jacket, plain pants, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. For the first time in years, he looked small. Mr. Whitmore? Clara asked. Are you all right? I need a favor, he said. Anything. He held out a bus ticket. I want you to take the day off. Clara frowned. Sir? I'm going into the city. Alone. I'd like you not to tell my sons. Clara studied his face. Something in his eyes worried her. With respect, she said, you shouldn't be wandering around New York by yourself in this weather. Nathaniel almost smiled. That's what I hoped someone would say. Before she could answer, the front doors opened. The sons had arrived for the weekly family meeting. Preston sought his father's clothes and stopped. What are you wearing? Nathaniel looked at them calmly. I need each of you to come with me today. Where? Blake asked. Manhattan. Ethan groaned. For what? Nathaniel said, I want to see how people treat me when they don't know my name. Preston rubbed his forehead. Dad, this is ridiculous. Maybe, Nathaniel said. Come anyway. Preston claimed he had a conference call. Blake said he had a charity luncheon. Ethan said he wasn't feeling well. Clara stood in the hallway, listening. Nathaniel nodded as if each excuse had been expected. Very well. He turned toward the door. Clara grabbed her coat. I'll go with you. The three sons stared at her. Ethan laughed. Why? Hoping for a tip? Clara looked at him, hurt flashing across her face, but her voice stayed steady. No. I'm hoping your father gets home safe. Nathaniel and Clara took the train into Grand Central Terminal. No driver. No security. No private car. Just a billionaire in old clothes and a maid carrying an umbrella with a bent handle. In the city, Nathaniel walked slower than usual. People bumped past him without apology. A man cursed when Nathaniel paused at a crosswalk. A woman at a coffee shop ignored him until Clara stepped forward and ordered for both of them. At noon, they stopped outside one of Nathaniel's own hotels in Midtown. The Whitmore Grand. Gold letters. Glass doors. A doorman in a pressed uniform. Nathaniel approached the entrance. The doorman blocked him. Guests only. Nathaniel looked up. I'd like to sit in the lobby for a moment. You can't loiter here. Clara's jaw tightened. He's not loitering. He just needs to rest. The doorman looked Clara up and down. Ma'am, there's a diner 2 blocks over. Nathaniel turned away without arguing. Clara followed him, angry now. That man works for you, she said. Nathaniel nodded. And he doesn't know it. They walked 2 blocks to the diner. Inside, Nathaniel's hands shook as he lifted his cup of soup. Clara noticed. Your chest, she asked. It's nothing. No, sir. Nothing doesn't make a man hold his breath. He tried to wave her off. A minute later, his face went pale. The spoon slipped from his hand. Clara stood so fast her chair scraped the floor. Nathaniel? He collapsed against the booth. Clara shouted for help, called 911, and held his hand until the ambulance arrived. At Mount Sinai, she stayed in the waiting room with wet shoes and trembling fingers. She called each son. Preston didn't answer. Blake texted, "Keep me updated." Ethan replied, "Is it serious?" Clara wrote back, "He is your father. Come now." 2 hours later, they arrived together, irritated and nervous. Preston walked straight to the front desk. "We're the Whitmore family. We need a private room." Clara stood. "He's still being examined." Blake looked at her coat dripping rainwater onto the floor. "Why are you still here?" Clara blinked. "Because nobody else was." Ethan muttered, "That's literally what we pay you for." Before Clara could answer, Richard Hayes, the attorney, stepped into the waiting room. The sons straightened. "Richard," Preston said. "What's going on?" Richard looked at Clara first. Then at the sons. "Your father is stable." All 3 sons exhaled. Then Richard said, "And he has asked that everyone come to the house tomorrow morning." Preston narrowed his eyes. "Everyone?" Richard's gaze shifted to Clara. "Yes," he said. "Everyone." The next morning, the mansion felt colder than usual. The sons gathered in the main room, whispering near the fireplace. Clara stood by the doorway in her work dress, unsure why she had been asked to attend. Nathaniel entered slowly, leaning on a cane. His face was tired, but his eyes were clear. Richard carried a leather folder. Nathaniel sat in his chair. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked at his sons. "When your mother died, I told myself grief was the reason this family changed. I told myself time would bring you back to who you were." Preston shifted uncomfortably. Nathaniel continued, "But time does not create character. It reveals it." Blake crossed his arms. "Dad, if this is about the assignments, we did what you asked." "No," Nathaniel said. "You did what was convenient. Ethan scoffed. You can't seriously judge us over 1 week. Nathaniel looked at him. I didn't. Richard opened the folder and placed 3 photographs on the table. The first showed Preston leaving the Newark shelter without signing the repair approval. The second showed Blake smiling for a social media photo outside St. Agnes while Sophie's mother cried inside. The third showed Ethan at a golf course at the exact time he was supposed to be interviewing scholarship students. The sons went silent. Clara looked down, embarrassed to witness it. Nathaniel then placed 1 more photograph on the table. It showed Clara in the diner, kneeling beside him, holding his hand while paramedics rushed in. This was not the first test, Nathaniel said softly. It was the last. Preston's face hardened. You had us followed? I had my promises followed, Nathaniel replied. Because promises matter when they're made to people who have nothing. Blake stepped forward. Dad, we're your sons. Yes, Nathaniel said. And that should have meant more than it did. Ethan pointed toward Clara. And what? She passes because she called an ambulance? Clara's eyes filled, but she stayed quiet. Nathaniel's voice sharpened. She passed because she saw a person where you saw a problem. No one spoke. Then Nathaniel turned to Clara. 22 years ago, when my wife was sick, you stayed overnight 3 times a week without being asked. When my company nearly collapsed in 2009, you brought me coffee at 2 a.m. and told me not to let fear make me cruel. When my sons forgot my birthday last year, you baked a cake and pretended the idea was theirs. Clara wiped her cheek quickly. Nathaniel's voice broke. And yesterday, when I was nobody in old clothes, you still treated me like somebody. Preston looked away. Blake swallowed hard. Ethan stared at the floor. Richard removed a document from the folder. Nathaniel said, I have changed the structure of Whitmore Holdings. Preston's head snapped up. What does that mean? It means none of you will inherit control of the company. The room exploded. Preston shouted, You can't do that. Blake said, After everything we've done? Nathaniel stared at him. What exactly have you done? Ethan's face turned red. You're giving it to the maid? Clara stepped back. No. Sir, I don't want. Nathaniel raised a gentle hand. I'm not giving you a burden you never asked for, Clara. He turned to his sons. Controlling interest will move into a charitable trust. The trust will fund shelters, children's medical care, scholarships, and emergency housing across the country. Clara Mae Jenkins will serve as the first community chair because she understands the people this family forgot. Clara covered her mouth. Nathaniel continued, Each of my sons will receive enough to live comfortably. But no executive power. No blank checks. No inherited throne. Preston's voice dropped cold. You're destroying your legacy. Nathaniel shook his head. No. I'm saving it from becoming only a last name on a building. For the first time, Blake looked truly shaken. What about us? Nathaniel's expression softened, but only slightly. You will each be offered 1 path back. Preston, the Newark shelter still needs heat. Blake, Sophie still needs her wheelchair. Ethan, those students still deserve to be seen. You will do the work quietly, without cameras, without announcements, without using my name. Not for inheritance. For your souls. Ethan laughed bitterly, but his eyes were wet. And if we don't? Nathaniel looked toward the window, where morning light touched the room his wife once decorated. Then you will have proven that money was the only language you ever learned from me. The first to leave was Preston. He slammed the door so hard a vase shook. Blake followed, silent and pale. Ethan stayed a moment longer. He looked at Clara. For once, there was no joke in his face. Did he really forget his birthday? He asked. Clara nodded. Ethan's lips trembled, but he turned away before anyone could see. 3 days passed. Then a furnace repair crew arrived at the Newark shelter, paid in full. No press. No cameras. Just Preston in jeans and a winter coat, carrying boxes of blankets from the back of a truck. Denise, the volunteer, didn't thank him right away. She simply handed him another box. At St. Agnes Hospital, Sophie received her wheelchair. Blake sat with her mother in the hallway and listened for 20 minutes without checking his phone. When Sophie rolled toward him for the first time and whispered, "Thank you," Blake had to step into the stairwell to cry. And in Philadelphia, Ethan showed up at Lincoln High with no assistant. He sat across from Marcus Reed, the student he had missed, and asked about his life. Marcus told him about working nights at a grocery store, caring for his little sister, and studying engineering from library books because he couldn't afford a laptop. Ethan listened. Really listened. When the scholarship committee approved all 5 students, Ethan added a personal apology letter to each file. Not all wounds healed quickly. Nathaniel did not suddenly become the perfect father. His sons did not suddenly become saints. But something had cracked open. And sometimes, that is where grace begins. 6 months later, the first Whitmore Community House opened in Newark. The old shelter had new windows, real beds, a children's reading room, and a kitchen that smelled like soup instead of bleach. There was a small ceremony, but no red carpet. Nathaniel sat in the front row beside Clara. Preston stood in the back, quietly helping stack chairs. Blake arrived with Sophie and her mother. Ethan came with Marcus, who had just received his acceptance letter from Penn State. When the mayor invited Nathaniel to speak, he stood slowly and looked at the crowd. "I spent most of my life thinking success was measured by what people built in my name," he said. "But I was wrong. Success is measured by who is warmer, safer, stronger, and less alone because you lived." His eyes moved to Clara. "This woman worked in my house for 22 years. But she never served money. She served people. And when my own family forgot what kindness looked like, she reminded us." The crowd turned toward Clara. She shook her head, embarrassed, but people began to applaud. Then Nathaniel handed her a key. Not a mansion key. Not a luxury car key. A simple brass key to the new community house. Clara held it like it weighed more than gold. After the ceremony, Ethan approached her near the doorway. He looked younger somehow, stripped of arrogance. "Miss Clara," he said quietly, "I'm sorry for the way I talked to you." Clara studied him for a moment. Then she said, "Sorry is a good first step. But it's only a step." He nodded. "I know." She handed him a broom. "Then help me clean up." Ethan looked at the broom. Then at his father. Then he smiled faintly and took it. Across the room, Nathaniel watched his son sweep the floor of a shelter he once thought was beneath him. And for the first time in years, the old billionaire felt something richer than pride. He felt hope. Because the truth was simple. A man can leave his children money and still leave them poor. He can give them houses and still leave them homeless inside. But if he teaches them compassion before it is too late, he gives them something no market crash, no lawsuit, and no death can take away. That day, the billionaire's greatest heir was not the son who wanted the company. It was the woman who had never asked for anything. The maid who saw a frightened old man on the floor and shows love before reward. And in the end, that was the only test that ever mattered.